Humans weren't exactly welcomed by the galactic community with open arms at first, or wings, tentacles, or whatever other appendage one might have. There were several reasons for this. The first, of course, is that they're terrifying. Well, terrifying is perhaps an exaggeration. Certainly there are predators which look more intimidating. Big teeth, sharp claws, that sort of thing. It was more the idea that a predator could be sentient at all that unsettled people. That, and the fact that when the rest of the galaxy learned about them, they were in the middle of their conflict with the Kalu-Kamsku. Now, no one shed too many tears for the Kalu-Kamsku, but the first documented evidence of humans that made it to the wider galaxy were human soldiers fighting Kalu-Kamsku armed recon teams. And, well, seeing bits of Kamsku everywhere tended to leave a negative first impression. Add to that the fact that they live in a relatively remote area of space and are technologically underdeveloped compared to most of the galaxy. It was an effort for anyone to visit them, and they didn't have the ships to explore the galaxy themselves. In short, humans were very isolated at first, and given their propensity for violence, the rest of the galaxy was happy to leave them that way. Except for the UNK. The UNK are something of an anomaly themselves, or at least the ecology of their homeworld is. The planet UN itself is fairly typical of many planets that give rise to sentient life. Rocky, much smaller than a gas giant, having an atmosphere and an ionosphere and sitting at the right distance from its star for liquid water to exist. An Amia or a Tok-Tok, or indeed a human, would feel perfectly at home in its temperate environment. But there are no predators there. None at all. The exact reasons for this have long been debated, but the broad scientific consensus is that for the first 100 million years after multicellular life evolved, UN's ecology was more or less like any other similar planet. There were sessile photosynthesizers, motile herbivores that fed on them, and carnivores that fed on the herbivores. However, then there was a mass extinction, and that's where UN's path diverged. There's only so much you can tell from fossils, but it's thought that a single species of plant evolved a highly effective poison, to the point that it became inedible to all herbivores. Because UN only had one continent in that period, it was able to spread across virtually the entire landmass of the planet, outcompeting every other form of plant life and rendering all the food chains that relied on them extinct. The plant became so pervasive that toxins from its decomposing foliage were carried into the rivers and poisoned the oceans as well, killing everything above the level of plankton. All this took place over a very short space of time, geologically speaking, much less than 1 million years, and possibly only a few millennia. Before anything could evolve a defense against the poison, it had wiped out virtually every other multicellular life form. It's theorized that the pre-existing ecology managed to hang on across a few isolated volcanic islands, where the native herbivores had no natural predators. Every so often, one of these herbivores would make it to the mainland, and for millions of years it would immediately die as soon as it tried to eat the local plant life. But eventually, a chance mutation occurred, and some extremely fortunate herbivore washed up and found itself in an environment where it had absolutely no competition. From there, UN's ecological development proceeded more or less as normal. The plant that caused the mass extinction began to evolve into different species as it adapted to environmental changes and the reintroduction of herbivores, and the new class of herbivore that was able to metabolize its poisons did likewise. 100 million years later, UN's wildlife was as diverse as any other planet's, except for the fact that predators never re-evolved. All animal life on the planet could trace its ancestry back to that one lucky castaway, which apparently was so specialized for a herbivorous lifestyle that none of its descendants ever found it practical to go the carnivore route. Roughly 300 million years later, one of those descendant branches evolved into the UNK, and they evolved in an environment with no predators. Now, at first glance, this might seem an odd species to reach out to the newly discovered humans. In fact, you'd think the UNK would be the last species that would want to have anything to do with the galaxy's first sentient carnivores. Humans, as meat eaters, are more alien to the UN than almost any other planet in the galaxy that bears intelligent life. Almost, but not quite, although we won't go into the WRickWrites and the HFY right now. However, there is one thing the UNK lack that is universal in every other sentient species: fear. Before they left their home planet, the UNK had no concept of a predator, and therefore they had no instinctive fear of other life forms. Well, it's not entirely true to say that they lack the emotion of fear completely. They have an instinctive apprehension towards approaching storms, and they aren't strong swimmers, so they shy away from large bodies of water. But in general, they're a lot more relaxed than most species, because unlike most species, they never had to be constantly watchful for something with big teeth and bad intent lurking in the bushes. Incidentally, even after they left their home planet, the UNK didn't have much to fear from predators. The toxic arms race between the dominant plant life on UN and the herbivores had continued, just without the sudden overwhelming success the former had previously experienced. The UNK's typical foods are all highly poisonous to most other species in the galaxy, and the poison accumulates in their bodies. This may be one reason that predators never evolved again on UN, as trying to become a carnivore would expose them to several hundred times the dose they'd been used to. As I understand it, the UNK are so saturated with toxins they actually smell poisonous, and most carnivores have decent olfactory senses. It must give you a certain confidence to know that anything that tried to take a bite out of you would drop dead. Incidentally, the UNK have a complex relationship with their food. Even with their toxin resistance, the process of making some of their dishes safe for them to eat is long and complicated, and their culture has made it something between an art form and a sport. A significant amount of the average UNK's leisure time is spent discussing recipes with their friends. The discovery of humans provoked concern among the UNK, of course. Just because they don't feel fear doesn't mean they can't understand danger on an intellectual level. Humans were clearly capable of extreme violence. However, they didn't experience the same immediate subconscious aversion most species felt when they first learned of humans. Given the Kalukamsku's, well, undiplomatic nature, it was possible they had provoked the conflict. Being unusually level-headed, the UNK decided to give humans a chance. At the very least, there should be no harm in taking a closer look at them. By the time they reached this decision, the conflict between the humans and the Kalukamsku was coming to an end. It had finally occurred to the Kalukamsku to ask themselves why this unknown species was killing them. They came to the conclusion that humans were A, sentient, and B, probably viewed their attempt to sterilize a human colony so they could mine the planet as an act of aggression. Better late than never, I suppose. When the Kalukamsku finally tried to communicate, they were somewhat surprised to find that the humans were actually receptive to negotiation. I am fairly sure the first Kamsku ship given the task of making contact thought they were being sent on a suicide mission. Of course, being the Kamsku, they were still too obtuse to work out why their enemy wanted to talk. They were just glad the humans had finally stopped slaughtering them. But the UNK figured it out almost immediately, and it prompted them to advance their plans from observation to first contact. It's important to remember that throughout the human-Kamsku conflict, the flow of information was entirely one way. That is, the rest of the galaxy got regular updates on events through their embassies with the Kalukamsku, while the humans had absolutely no information about what was going on outside their little corner of the galaxy. The UNK correctly deduced that humanity had had no idea that there were other intelligent species in the galaxy before their encounter with the Kalukamsku, and still were unaware that there were any others besides the Kalukamsku. From the way negotiations progressed between the humans and the Kamsku, it seemed like the humans were intensely, profoundly curious about the aliens. It has to be said, the UNK are not a particularly curious species themselves, certainly not like us Amia. They have no equivalent of the science consortium, spread out across the galaxy looking for new discoveries. It's more in their nature to set a goal and head towards it rather than investigate every new thing they come across. Our view of them tends to be of rather dull, plodding creatures, although in return they find us hyperactive and somewhat intrusive, which is fair enough. However, new sentient species aren't exactly a common occurrence, and one of the UNK's ongoing goals is to maintain mutually beneficial relations with other spacefaring civilizations. This was something that deserved their attention. They understood humanity's curiosity, just like they understood every other species' fear, and they saw a UNK-shaped hole in the equation. They approached the Kalukamsku and asked for an introduction. The Kalukamsku were at first reluctant to add what they referred to as a random disruptive element into their delicate negotiations with the humans, but the UNK pointed out to them, or spelled out very slowly with simple words, that humans might react more positively to a species that hadn't killed quite so many of them. Plus, the Kamsku weren't exactly known for their skills at diplomacy. The negotiations might go a lot more smoothly with input from the UNK. The Kamsku may be obtuse, but at least they're logical. They could see the sense in what the UNK were suggesting, so they agreed to ask the human ambassadors if they would consent to the introduction of a third party. And naturally, the humans jumped at the chance. I have to imagine that they must have been at least nervous. Those first UNK who were selected to make first contact with humans. They couldn't feel fear in the way we understand the emotion, but they must at least have felt a heightened state of alertness, surely. Humans had only been introduced to one alien species before them, and it had resulted in a lot of violence. They couldn't have been sure how the humans would react to them. I can't even imagine what the humans thought of the UNK. Imagine a lumpy cylinder, and give it 6 legs that stick up at a 45-degree angle from the body, then curve down. In fact, only the bit that sticks up is actually the leg. From the joint to the blunted tip is a keratinous growth not dissimilar to a giant claw. The UNK are essentially walking on stilts, useful for wading through swampy ground or stepping through dense, possibly toxic foliage. The cylindrical body doesn't hold itself level. The back end faces down slightly, because this is where their mouth is. Well, I say mouth. It was a slight surprise to the UNK when they found out that most species have a separate orifice for ingesting food and expelling waste. The front end is even stranger. The UNK's 8 eye stalks are almost a meter long, about the same length as their body. 4 have large, round eyes at the tip, but the other 4 only have vestigial eyes that have been superseded by the eyelids, which have evolved into grasping pads, giving them 4 tentacles they can use to manipulate objects. For the humans, the Kalu Kamsku must have looked practically familiar by comparison. At least they bore a passing resemblance to organisms that are found on Earth, although then again the fact that they look more or less like a giant praying mantis might not have done them any favors. As I understand it, humans aren't particularly fond of the insects, even when they're only a few centimeters long, let alone 5 meters. For xenopsychologists like us, one of the great joys of studying anything that involves the UNK is that they document everything meticulously, and they don't mind sharing. We have full, high-definition video of their first meeting with the human ambassadors. The room was a large one, obviously, to accommodate the 10 Kalukamsku, who entered first, followed by their 3 much smaller guests, who stayed close to the doors. The UNK had suggested that they keep their distance at first. Firstly, because their appearance might unsettle the humans, and secondly, because most species find their smell off-putting at best. The humans enter the room and proceed to the seats provided. There are 10 of them. 4 diplomats escorted by 6 of their hunter caste. Soldiers, as they call them. Unarmed, but an unarmed human trained specifically to kill is more dangerous than just about any weapon you could carry. The Kalukamsku approached the table and formally introduced the UNK lingering at the back of the room, waiting for a sign that it was okay to approach. The humans seemed to be confident at first, but almost as soon as the diplomats sit, they start shifting uncomfortably. Finally, one of them asks, "Did someone bring coffee?" Even at a distance, the humans could smell the UNK. However, contrary to what the UNK expected, it wasn't the first time they'd encountered that smell, and they didn't find it repulsive. Quite the opposite, in fact. The human diplomat seemed deeply confused about why there was suddenly an all-pervasive smell of coffee in the room, to the point where one of them got up and started trying to find the source of the scent. The Kalukamsku skittered back as he got closer to them, but the UNK, of course, remained exactly where they were. The human asked if he could approach them, and, being completely unafraid, the UNK delegates consented. Interesting piece of trivia. Humans aren't carnivores. We usually call them that because to an amia, the fact that they eat meat is the most notable thing about them. But technically speaking, humans are omnivores. They can eat a wide variety of plants and plant products, and to them the UNK smelled exactly like a plant whose seeds they roast, grind, and mix into beverages. They call it coffee. It is, to us and most of the rest of the galaxy, extremely poisonous. In the days before Amia made contact with other sentient species, it was theorized by our scientists that any aliens we encountered would be fructivores, like us. Slightly solipsist, you might think, but there's logic behind it. After all, plants have an evolutionary incentive to provide the animals that eat their fruit with a good meal. There should always be more calories in specializing in fruit than in eating other parts of a plant, which the plant will be trying to stop you from eating. And the more specialized consumer always has an advantage over the jack-of-all-trades. They were completely wrong about the first part, of course. Fruit eaters are common among intelligent species, but they're far from universal. But they had a point about specialization. If you want to do something well, you've got to devote yourself to it entirely, and that includes what you eat. The downside of specialization is that you're more vulnerable to interruptions in your food supply, but that's exactly why intelligent species are more likely to be specialists. Because once you get smart enough, you can control your natural environment and eliminate that downside. Most intelligent species specialize in a limited range of food sources and therefore have a limited tolerance for chemicals not found in their natural diet. But being omnivores, humans have a natural resistance to a wide variety of natural toxins. A lot of chemicals that for an amia would be a cause for an immediate and urgent trip to hospital are to humans just a more piquant flavoring to liven up their food with. It seems a little unfair, given how ridiculously durable humans are in just about every other area, that they're also highly resistant to poison. In fact, the only species with a similar broad-spectrum resistance are the UNK, because their toxin-laden plant life has, through parallel evolution, produced many of the same chemical defenses found in Earth's biosphere. In fact, it's thought that the original toxin that caused the mass extinction on Yuan was caffeine, the active ingredient in coffee, a highly potent neurotoxin to most species, but to humans and UNK, merely a mild stimulant. The plants on Yuan are almost all highly poisonous, unlike on most planets, including Earth, where only a minority are, and there are so many different types that between them they've evolved almost all the chemicals found in coffee, including compounds like 2,4-furylthiol, which contribute to the aroma. The similarities don't stop there. Both Earth and UN have a lot of poisonous alkaloids in common. When the human diplomat got within touching distance of the UNK delegates, he stopped. His colleagues had the same fear response to the unknown that you or I would have. Humans have that in common with us, at least. So they stayed back and asked him if the aliens were the source of the aroma. He confirmed that they were, but now that he was closer, he could smell something else. Something familiar. Chocolate. To humans, the UNK smell of coffee and chocolate. The humans were baffled. The UNK, on the other hand, were interested. It didn't occur to them to worry that their predatory counterparts found their odor appealing. They had never encountered another species that appreciated their cuisine, or indeed could survive it. And the UNK really do like their food. The UNK had decided to make contact with humans merely because they saw that humans wanted to know more about the wider galaxy, and they felt there was no reason not to assist them. Friendly relations with other species generally benefited both. However, they had discovered much more than they bargained for. They had finally found a species they could swap recipes with. The human diplomats had expected to be talking about ending their conflict with the Kamsku, but when the UNK started interrogating them about what flavorings humans used in their food, they soon got deep into a conversation about whether the UNK smelled more like an espresso or a mocha, and progressed from there. It should be mentioned that the Kalu Kamsku hadn't the slightest idea what was going on, but since the UNK seemed to be engaging in a dialogue with the humans, for once they did the sensible thing and didn't interrupt. So what's the lesson here? Well, first of all, if you're worried about a human trying to eat you and want to know how to make yourself unappealing, you can cross-coding yourself in poison off your list. They'll probably just thank you for marinating yourself for them. All right, there is a serious lesson too. It's an easy trap for xenopsychologists to fall into to assume that common ground between species is found by talking about important things like systems of government, technological development, major cultural traits. By that logic, a species of predators and a species from a planet with no predators should have had absolutely nothing in common. And yet, through their shared interest in mixing poisons into their food, the UNK had more to talk about with humans than any other species they'd encountered. More meetings followed, trade opened up, and soon both species had an insatiable desire for the other's culinary products. Sometimes the little things can make a big difference. The fact that the UNK, the ultimate pacifists, had managed to establish friendly relations with humans went a long way to assuaging other species' misgivings about them. And after the brutal conflict with the Kalu Kamsku, it really improved humans' view of aliens when they found out that there was a whole planet out there that smelled of coffee and chocolate.